All right, let's take a look at some objections to pacifism. The responses a pacifist may make in response to those objections. Assess as well the strength of those responses as well as the strength of the objections, and also some arguments for pacifism. Many of which will kind of come out as we assess and look at pacifists' responses to their objections. So why are we doing this? One, I'm not trying to make you all peace hippies. I'm not a peace hippie myself, whatever that means. Two, I'll just come out and just say I'm actually not a pacifist per se, especially not pacifist as understood through this presentation. But it's a good idea if many of you who may not be pacifists to actually look at the strength of the position that you're against or you don't believe. Oftentimes the strength of your own position will come out, and you might need to refine your views. Who knows? So let's just move on. Objection 1. Pacifism is for cowards. So here's how the objection goes. Pacifists only advocate nonviolence because they are afraid of suffering from violence. So I'm here, to put voice to it, I object to this war because I'm a pacifist. People might take that to mean as you object to the war because you're too cowardly to enlist in the army and fight, unlike the rest of your fellow Americans. So this objection focuses on the motivation of a pacifist and the psychology of pacifists, and accuses them of having a certain vice, the vice of cowardice. And of course, a moral position that stems from a vice would be that would defeat justification for that moral position. You'd have to find some new support, or you might want to rethink that moral position. Basically, if only persons with a certain vice have a certain moral belief, then that undercuts the strength of the support for that moral belief. So it's a pretty potent objection, at least initially. Well, there's a problem with it though. First, this might be true of some pacifists, contingently true of some pacifists. But pacifists could avoid the cowardice objection because they have examples throughout history of other pacifists who are willing to suffer violence even though they refuse to participate in it. So, like for an example, according to many readings of the New Testament, Jesus Christ may have been a pacifist. He certainly, according to the New Testament record, didn't fight back against the Romans when they crucified him. Gandhi, who is a well-known advocate of nonviolence, suffered beatings, was imprisoned, certainly didn't have an easy life, certainly wasn't cowardly. Martin Luther King Jr., read his letter from the Birmingham prison that he wrote from prison for nonviolent protests, where he was responding to violently against Alabama police, for example. So this objection just doesn't work because there's actual plenty of examples of non-cowardly pacifists who have suffered more because they're pacifists, who, had they not been pacifists, would have suffered less. Okay, next objection, the free rider objection. Pacifists benefit from social goods that are produced through military power, while they, the pacifists, contribute nothing to the production of those goods. I'll just keep reading. So the objection goes, pacifism is unjust because pacifists share in the benefits without taking up the burdens and obligations that are tied to those benefits. So think about some of the perhaps freedoms we have, some of the economic goods we have, some of the peace and stability that we enjoy right now. A lot of that, so the objection goes, we wouldn't have had it not been for war. Various wars that we've fought, various military actions that we've used, various violent tactics, unfortunately. Pacifists benefit from them just as much as non-pacifists do. But they're not willing to contribute towards the attainment of those goods that they're benefiting from, while others are. So, in a sense, it's kind of like they're hypocrites, I guess. That'd be one way of thinking about it. All right. This objection is more potent than the first. I think this has a lot more promise than the first. And it doesn't, depict them in a positive light, as the couch potato illustrates. However, the pacifist also has a response to that. They can argue that in addition to their moral principles requiring that they be a pacifist, they say those same principles also require that the pacifists work to transform society such that its social benefits aren't gained through military power. So as long as a pacifist, the pacifists might respond that you're right, there are some benefits that we have right now that were attained through military violence. However, one, we're going to transform society, or at least we are working to transform society so that we can continue to get those benefits without using military force. And if we can do that, then we can show that it wasn't needed to begin with to get these certain goods. So, further, the pacifists can engage in productive social endeavors that don't necessitate the use of violence or war, such as, and this is like true of including the United States. We have found ways to use the talents of pacifists, conscientious objectors, who can volunteer their talents and engage in nonviolent activities that support the common good. So the state has found a way to use pacifists to contribute to the common good. So they're doing their part. They're just not doing that part. So it's this last point I don't think really addresses the objection with full force, because they're still benefiting from goods attained by military violence. They're, so it weakens the objection, but it doesn't completely remove it, basically. Okay, objection 3. Pacifism is for traitors. So the objection goes, pacifism is unpatriotic and possibly treasonous, because if pacifists are unwilling to fight to defend the nation, then in a sense they're basically betraying the nation and helping the enemy. So they have too many friends, quote unquote, since they're unwilling to take up arms against their enemy. So if you're not willing to fight North Korea, then you must be on the same side as North Korea. If you're not willing to fight Al-Qaeda, then you must be on the same side as Al-Qaeda. If you're not willing to fight the Nazis, then you're effectively helping the Nazis. But if you're effectively helping the Nazis, then you're a traitor. So this objection, if sound, is devastating. I can't think of anything worse than being, a traitor, especially when you're helping horrific enemies. So the question is, does this objection really succeed? Well, the pacifist does have a response. The pacifist can claim that there are higher goods than the state. So, for example, there's a good chance that many persons taking this online course are religious. This is the state of Indiana. I have access to statistical data, and some of you may not. That's fine. Pay attention anyways. So religious persons may hold the belief that there are higher goods other than the state, even if they aren't pacifists. So, for example, religious persons say they're subject to God's law over state law. And when the two conflict, then you have to go with God's law. So the Apostle Paul in Romans, I think, says you should obey the law except when it conflicts with God's law. I'm, of course, paraphrasing. There have been Christian thinkers as well, such as Stanley Hauerwas at Duke and Tolstoy, the guy who wrote War and Peace, who took it one step further and argued that the Christian faith requires that one overcome one's attachment to the state as well as one's hatred of enemies. So here's a note. One of these Christian pacifists, Stanley Hauerwas, studied under a guy that we're going to be reading soon, Alistair McIntyre, when we studied on patriotism. I point this out because they're going to be using similar principles to reach radically different conclusions. Okay, so that's the response to objection 3. And I made a point in one of the first lectures on ethics last week that there's a distinction between what is legal and what is moral. And sometimes things are legal that are not moral, and sometimes things are moral that are not legal. And I gave the example of it used to be legal to whip slaves, but we certainly wouldn't say that's moral. In fact, we would say that is horrible. It is grossly immoral. Further, it used to be illegal for African Americans to eat at white lunch counters in the South in the 1960s. And while that was illegal, we certainly wouldn't say it was immoral. So this objection is basically this response to the objection stemming from the same thing. Well, it's not quite the same response, but it's similar. You got to draw a distinction. Basically, the state isn't like the final say of what the moral law is, basically. And sometimes the state can get it wrong with the moral law. Or sometimes it's an evaluational point. It's just there are things that are more valuable than the state. Okay, and that's enough about that. Objection 4. Pacifism is the pathology of the privileged. All right, so the objection goes, it is easy for someone who is not oppressed to advocate nonviolence. And the powerful can further use the ideology of pacifism as a tool with which to further oppress those who are unwilling to take up arms in defense of human rights. So we grew up in the United States for the most part. Most of us have not experienced war, except for any veterans in this class, I welcome you, and perhaps any international students who did grow up in war-torn countries, in which I welcome you as well. For the majority of us Americans, though, we even when our country was at war, it wasn't at war on United States soil. So we've just never really experienced the horrors of war. So we've never really been in that position where it's a choice between violence and nonviolence, where using nonviolence could mean your existential extinction, basically. So the objection goes, these ivory tower academics who don't know what the real world is like are pacifists, but had they knew what the real world was like, they wouldn't be. They have this rich, cushy lifestyle, but we're in the real world, damn it. So there's the guy from Titanic. I don't think he was a pacifist, but All right. Again, this response is, if sound, is devastating. Most pacifists don't want to be thought of as only advocating a position that comes from their privilege, basically, from their cushy existence. However, one response they have, it's not a knockdown argument, it's just a response, is nonviolence is a moral requirement that transcends class and national ideology. So they could argue it just because, as of right now, a lot of pacifists come from privileged backgrounds. That isn't enough in itself to show that pacifism is false. Our views on nonviolence don't just apply to us because we're rich; they apply to everyone. It just so happens that right now a lot of us come from privileged backgrounds, and I think there's something to that. And I mean, they could also bite the bullet further and say, yeah, it's a lot easier for us to be pacifists in our privileged background, but it's still wrong for people from non-privileged backgrounds to use violence. When they use violence, even though we've never been in a situation like that, regardless, even when someone who does use violence, they're doing the wrong thing. So they could, why not say that? So, this is kind of so remember the term epistemology, the study of knowledge? Well, I like to say that this is the epistemological equivalent of a Mexican standoff. So if you ever watched Westerns or like Tarantino and Guillermo Gonzalez films, it's a Mexican standoff is when you have two different parties pointing guns at each other, and then they both fire at each other and they all die. I guess a lot of Mexican Western cinema and Mexican gang cinema features these things. I'm not sure. I don't know much about the history of the phrase, but I think you get the point. This type of argument, in a sense, well, basically the pacifists aren't going to accept the premises of the objection, but the objector isn't going to accept the premises that the pacifist appeals to in responding to the objection. But they both have a solid response. So it's like a standstill. It's just you don't get anywhere. Not saying that you can't resolve the debate. I'm just saying you can't resolve the debate through this objection. You have to find some other objections and responses. Okay, but it kind of like neutralizes the objection or response. So no one gets any points, but no one loses any points either. Okay. Objection 5. We call this the clean hands objection. So many of you might have weird New Age relatives. I've got one who last Christmas asked, we have a family gift exchange. My family celebrates Christmas during the holidays. Some of you might celebrate Hanukkah or other holidays. That's great. For our particular gift exchange, we request a gift for like $20. It's usually like a gift card somewhere. She requested like a gallon of kidney beans for their magical properties, I guess. So yeah, someone gave her that. So anyways, this objection kind of plays on that stereotype. It must have stemmed from the 1960s of someone that's just out of touch with reality. So pacifists are so committed to keeping their hands clean that they fail to act on other requirements of life. They're basically disconnected from the world of concrete human reality, or as what Elizabeth Anscombe said in the article War on Murder, the pacifist holds withdrawal from the world as man's only salvation. So they basically like don't contribute to the world anymore. They just let it go to ruin. And as a result, they also don't really understand the world anymore. Because they don't want to get stained by the world. I'm using a lot of religious language. But you'll find in ethics classes that a lot of normative ethical language has a lot of overlap with a lot of religious language. Now, why that is so is that you should take a class on ethics and religion, or philosophy of religion. So we won't talk about that in this class anymore. So how can they respond to this objection? Well, they have two responses. They could say, well, the world would be a better place if everyone took the pacifist obligation seriously and refused to compromise with evil. So Gandhi's favorite quote, although I've been told that maybe someone else said it. Well, it doesn't matter who said it. It's the quote that matters. An eye for an eye, taking on Old Testament ethics, it would make the whole world blind. So basically, we're all that type of notion of justice just wouldn't get the world anywhere. It wouldn't make the world a better place if we practice that type of retributive justice that pacifists, that I guess a lot of warfare assumes. Like, you killed one of our soldiers, we can kill yours in return. All right. Second, the absolutist moral framework. So pacifists tend to be absolutists, at least about war and violence, at least about that. And an absolutist says, yes, it just so happens that you can't participate in that. You do have to keep your hands clean. That's just what it is to be an exceptionless rule, which is, remember, what absolutism holds. There are exceptionless moral rules. So you should get, I'm hoping you're gathering by now that pacifists tend to not be consequentialists. They tend to be more non-consequentialists. They're deontologists. And that is certainly true, and a lot of the responses to these objections come from that deontological, non-consequentialist ethical framework, whereas a lot of the objections to pacifism tend to come from a consequentialist framework. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. So that's interesting. Some of these great debates aren't really debates between two particular ethical issues, between pacifism and just war theory, for example. Instead, they stem from two normative views. Most people don't realize that, but that's where it's coming from. So the debate about torture and closing Guantanamo Bay, the debate right now with Edward Snowden and privacy rights by the NSA. Well, on the one hand, we've stopped terrorist attacks, but on the other hand, we have these privacy rights that should not be violated. So you'll find that a lot of these debates come from that. Okay. Objection 6. So since a lot of pacifists have argued from religious perspectives, like Gandhi was a Hindu, Martin Luther King Jr. was Christian. So the idea is that pacifists from a religious background, for example, we'll just focus on Christianity since I guess we're in Indiana, got their theology wrong. Yeah. So Christian theology, for example, is committed to the necessity of war because of the fallen and sinful nature of human beings. For example, Old Testament and Paul's letter to the Romans allows the sovereign to use the sword to execute God's wrath. We aren't perfect, so we have to use the means of war and violence to attain these moral ends. And love of neighbor, and the need for further, our love of neighbor, which is certainly a command, and the need for just social order, actually, on occasion, necessitates just wars. So think, for example, intervening. A lot of people wanted us to go to war in Darfur in the 2000s, when basically a systematic thing today, the genocide practically was going on. I think one number was like over 400,000 were killed. That would be, and a lot of people like that were opposed to the Iraq War wanted military action there. And a lot of it, I would believe that a lot of it would be because out of kind of a concern for the well-being of the innocent Sudanese who were being victimized, basically killed. So this is where the objection comes from. Pretty potent. Is there a response? Yeah. So one response on the pacifists is that just war theory, this is a response to the Christian objection, by the way. Just war theory is a later development of a lapsed Constantinian Christianity, not the message advocated by Jesus in the gospel. So it's what Christians have said, but not what Jesus said. 2, religious believers need to see beyond the materialistic defense of finite goods in this world. So they say a lot of war is over stuff like oil, or just a way of life with lots of social goods like freedom and stuff. Well, Christians need to be beyond We're in, but not of the world. 3. A commitment to nonviolence is supported by a theological worldview that sees the eternal consequences of temporal things. Well, that's kind of abstract. Again, I'm quoting the article. So, one day, Christians might believe that God will straighten everything out. I guess God's a judge. God will judge everything. So it's not the religious believer's job to do that then. Let God handle that. God will take care of, righting the wrongs done by rogue nations. Christians, though, shouldn't use violence to do that because then they're playing God. That's how the response goes. Okay. Objection 7. The other objections have kind of appealed, a lot of them have appealed to intuitions. This appeals to logic. If pacifism is actually contradictory, then it's just false. In game. There's no question about it. If pacifism has a contradiction in it, it is false. There's not much you can do to salvage at that point. I like this objection because I'm a philosopher. Intuitions are fickle. Everyone's intuitions are different. Logic, on the other hand, no, that doesn't, it's just, whether you like it or not, that matters. So, here's how the objection goes in. Pacifism results in a performative contradiction because an absolute pacifist who's unwilling to defend himself simply ends up dead. So by the pacifism, who's a pacifist against violence, against killing, for example, ends up getting killed. So here's a different version that maybe spells out the contradiction. Pacifism involves an internal contradiction. Because pacifists are unwilling to use violence to defend against aggression because they respect, and here's the reason pacifists are against violence is because they respect life and respect persons. But here's where the contradiction occurs. When a pacifist who claims that life is an absolute good is unwilling to take the necessary steps to defend their own life. So they're against violence because they respect life. But by refusing to engage in violence, they're letting the very thing they respect get destroyed. Life. That's bad. That's the contradiction. Here's the response. 1. Tu quoque. That's Latin for you also. Pacifism is no more self-contradictory than the idea that we might kill in order to defend life. So they just say the other position has that similar problem. 2. Distinguish between personal self-defense and defense of loved ones on the one hand, and war as a social movement on the other hand. The pacifists might be okay with the former, but not the latter. So remember, we're not talking about pacifism. We're talking mostly about pacifism as an ethical stance against war. Not against all violence, just against war. So the pacifists might be okay with violence of self-defense, but at the same time being against war. So if you draw that distinction, it seems to avoid that contradiction. Yeah, I'll give it to him. That distinction has some merit to it. Okay, objection 8. Pacifism is unjust. So this is similar to some other objections we've seen, but basically, we could use war to protect the innocent, like those in Darfur. Protect sovereignty, like our own, and uphold a just international order. We don't want chaos. We don't want the Joker to take over. All right. I won't spend much time unpacking it. Let's just see the response that the pacifists might offer. Okay. My computer is frozen up. Here we go. All right. Pacifists do value a just and tranquil social order. So don't say they don't, because they do. Further, a pacifist may be willing to die in defense of that order. But what is prohibited is killing in defense of that order. So pacifists might be perfectly okay with dying to save that order. They're just saying it's killing to do it. So they draw this. There's a distinction between dying and killing. Second, nonviolent means to defending a just order, according to the pacifists, are the best means because they are actually consistent with the ideals of justice to begin with. So why would we use unjust means to keep a just order when we can use just means to keep a just order? The pacifist says. Maybe they're right. I don't know. Objection 9. This is a consequentialist objection. Pacifism just isn't effective. So while there appear to be some cases of successful nonviolent action, such as those of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., these movements were successful because of unique historical circumstances. For example, Gandhi's success was made possible by British exhaustion from world wars, Martin Luther King Jr.'s success was due to the threats of violence from more radical movements such as the Black Panthers. And further, both Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.'s movements were successful because opponents were mostly sympathetic. This isn't true of a lot of situations, though. Like World War II is an example people often appeal to. So, yeah, it's just the examples pacifists use won't apply to all these situations. Further, nonviolence wouldn't have worked against Nazis or terrorists, and it is dangerously delusional to think otherwise. So President Obama said there is nothing weak in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King, but a head of state cannot be guided by pacifism. Thus, a nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies, and negotiations cannot convince Al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. So yeah, what could the pacifists say in response to that? Well, they might just appeal to the tragic, they might bite the bullet. Sometimes we do have to make tragic choices in which there's no genuinely good alternative. However, they'd say it's better to err on the side of peace and not contribute to harm. They'd say further that the examples of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. require careful historical analysis. Different historical circumstances may require different types of nonviolent action. Further, history does also show the horrors of war, and Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. show us that there is an alternative, so that's just kind of restating the view. And then how would they respond to Obama? Well, they could agree that war is an expression of human folly, and disagree with Obama that war is necessary. All right. Here's an argument for pacifism then. So I said we're going to look at some arguments for pacifism. Let's look at an argument. We've been looking at arguments against pacifism. Let's take a look at one for it. Their argument goes, pacifism is a skeptical position whose principal claim is that the proponent of killing cannot produce a single compelling argument for why killing another person is permissible. So the pacifist puts the burden on the non-pacifist to say, give me a single argument for why killing another person is permissible. Think about it. You could probably think of a few, or try to think of a few. So, for example, take the doctrine of proportionality. One person's harming another person is morally justified only if the harm is in proportion to the original harm done. So the support is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The philosophy of the proportionality, criterion, and just ad bellum, part of the just war theories. But here's how their argument goes then. And this is how the arguments work. We saw this in the arguments. If you don't like the conclusion for, this is a valid argument, by the way. So if you don't like the conclusion, you have to show me which premise is false. Okay? That's it. If you don't like the conclusion, you have to show me which premise is false. So let's read the premises. Premise 1. One person's harming another person is morally justified only if the harm is in proportion to the original harm done. That's the proportionality criterion. Premise 2. If a potential victim kills an aggressor in self-defense, then the potential victim kills the aggressor before the aggressor has actualized the malicious intention to kill the victim. That's a basic fact of killing in self-defense. So if you kill in self-defense, you've killed the aggressor before any harm has actually been done by the aggressor. So your harm isn't in proportion to a harm already done by the aggressor because the aggressor hasn't done the harm yet. Premise 3. If the potential victim kills the aggressor before the aggressor has actualized the malicious intention to kill the victim, then the potential victim's killing the aggressor in self-defense is out of proportion to the harm done, as the victim who kills was not himself or herself killed. Okay, so basically, yeah, from 1 and 2, it would be out of proportion because the aggressor's harm never was actualized. So, conclusion 4, if a potential victim kills an aggressor, then self-defense and that killing is not morally justified.